How's it going? So today we're going to be looking at George R. R. Martin's blog post regarding his complaints about season 2 of House of the Dragon. So just to clarify, in this video we're going to go through his initial blog post about his complaints about season 2, and then we're going to look at HBO's response, and we're also going to look at the podcast that the official House of the Dragon podcast put out on the same day that this post came out with showrunner Ryan Condal. So if you've watched any videos about this so far, you are probably going to have heard a million and one people read out this blog post. And now you're going to hear a million and one people read out this blog post because I am going to do just that for you. Because of the simple fact that I can't just link directly to his blog post because he has removed it. It lasted on his not a blog for about an hour before it was taken down. But luckily for us, I think people found it in the Wayback Machine, but people have also screenshotted it, obviously, because you can't put anything on the internet and expect it not to live there forever. So we're going to go through it. I have it on my Twitter bookmarks, and so I'm going to share the link of it in the description of this video if anybody else wants to go and follow along or have a read for themselves, although I'm sure you can probably find the re-uploads all over the shop at this stage. Okay, so my plan for this video is to go through paragraph by paragraph and talk about what George has said. Now, just a bit of foresight, there will be a spoiler warning somewhere in the middle of this video because he does go into spoilers for season 3 and season 4. But don't worry, I'll give you a warning before that so you can check out if you do not wish to hear anything that happened in Fire and Blood around the time that season 3 and season 4 are going to be based in their story off, or if you don't want to hear anything that is supposedly, allegedly in Ryan Condal's script plans for season 3. So don't worry, I'll give you a heads up. Also, just to address, do we like the scene change? We're currently in my sitting room. This is my bookcase of nonsense that my family have to put up with. Here's some more nonsense over here that I have also put in our family living room that my family have to put up with. God bless them, they're so good. Shout out to them. Okay, time to get into the blog post. He titled it Beware the Butterflies, and this was posted on September 4th in 2024. So he says, back in July, I promised you some further thoughts on Blood and Cheese and Maylor the Missing after my commentary on the first 2 episodes of House of the Dragon Season 2, A Son for a Son and Rhaenyra the Cruel. Now, obviously, like he says here, he promised that he was going to give further thoughts on this. I do believe that this was the first blog post and what he intended to be a series of him probably going through episode by episode, breaking down his issues with each. And because of how bombastic the response was to this first post, he obviously took it down, whether that was by his own personal choice or by some complaints of HBO, some sort of contract issue that he maybe wasn't aware of, just in terms of speaking out about HBO and the production and the showrunners, the staff on the show. It's very unclear to us at the minute, and it's unclear if we're going to get any further statement that's going to clarify this or not. But for the time being, we're really left in the dark about the whole thing. But I do believe this was supposed to be the first in a series of posts that he was going to make regarding his issues with the show. But he goes on to say, and we have, again, with this next paragraph, it's nothing particularly new. It's stuff that he was already talking about in his earlier praise in July for the first 2 episodes of the season. So he says here, those were terrific episodes, well written, well directed, and powerfully acted. A great way to kick off the new season. Fans and critics alike seemed to agree. There was only one aspect of the episodes that drew significant criticism, and that was the handling of Blood and Cheese and the death of Prince Jaehaerys. From the commentary I saw online, opinion was split there. The readers of Fire and Blood found the sequence to be underwhelming and a disappointment, watered down from what they expected. Viewers who had not read the books had no such problems. Most of them found the sequence a real gut punch, tragic, horrifying, nightmarish, etc. Some reported being reduced to tears. I found myself agreeing with both sides. And so at the very start of this, I really was reminded of the fact that he had such high praise for the acting and the characterization of particularly Helena in the first 2 episodes, because obviously Helena in the books isn't as developed or established as a character as she is in the show. And he reported that he'd really enjoyed what they did with the character in the show, and that Fia Saban's performance was particularly compelling. Despite the fact that there was a lot of criticism in the first episode that she didn't respond how a parent should to seeing their child beheaded. But, again, you have to consider she is a dreamer and she is also cast to be neurodivergent. And, there's a million and one factors you have to consider in this. You have to consider shock in this, the fight, flee response. Like, there was a lot of things that had to be considered that I feel like people were just expecting her to kick and scream and cry. And really, it was a lot more nuanced of a performance than that, which I particularly preferred. That was a lot more compelling and effective for me as a viewer. But again, a lot of people had issue with this. Martin, however, did compliment the performance and the characterization. And so that's kind of like what the start of this evoked for me. The second half, obviously, readers of Fire and Blood did have their issues with Blood and Cheese because it was, a significant deviation, which he is going to later talk about in this, so I'm not going to go into it now. But from the book portrayal of the event and the fact that Maelor the Missing is a component in the book who has not been introduced in the show. I think that is obviously the most significant deviation is the fact that Maelor was not a component and that there was not the Sophie's Choice element with Helena having to choose between her two sons and instead having to choose between the twins and tell them which was the male. Readers were quite underwhelmed, but viewers, casual viewers, were utterly disgusted at the fact that they just had to witness, well, off screen, just had to hear the dreaded soundscape of a child having their head sawn off and how disgusting that sequence was. He continues, in my book, Helena and Aegon have 3 children, not 2, like we just said. The twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, are 6 years old. They have a younger brother, Maelor, who is 2. When Blood and Cheese break in on Helena and the kids, they tell her they are debt collectors come to exact revenge for the death of Prince Lucerys, a son for a son. As Helena has 2 sons, however, they demand that she choose which one should die. She resists and offers her own life instead, but the killers insist that it has to be a son. If she does not name one, they will kill all 3 of the children. To save the life of the twins, Helena names Maelor, but Blood and Cheese kills the older boy Jaehaerys instead, while Cheese tells little Maelor that his mother wants him dead. Whether the boy is old enough to understand that is uncertain. He's 2. He's not going to understand. But I think this statement, obviously, like within the book, and we can talk about this if we're ever going into some sort of analysis of this particular chapter in A Fire and Blood. But I think this line is obviously delivered more to hurt Helena than it is to affect the son, which it obviously does because we see that she is kind of driven madness after this whole event and her feelings of guilt about how it came to be. But yeah, just on this, obviously we spoke about the fact that she has 3 children in the book. Maelor is there. He talks in the next paragraph that he doesn't know about the age of the twins, but I think it was in the House of the Dragon official podcast, Ryan Condal confirms that the actors that they have are 4, or perhaps, he's talking about the characters are supposed to be 4. So I suppose they obviously cast them in the middle ages between what the twins are actually supposed to be, which is 6 years old, and the baby Maelor, who's 2. So supposedly they're 4. That is not how it happened in the show. There is no Maelor in House of the Dragon, only the twins, whom both look younger than 6, but I'm no judge of children's age, so I can't be sure how old they're supposed to be. Blood can't seem to tell the twins apart, so Helena is asked to reveal which one is the boy. You would think a glance up his PJs would reveal that without involving the mother. This made me very uncomfortable to read, but there we go. Instead of offering her life to save the kids, Helena offers them a necklace. Blood and Cheese are not tempted. Blood saws Prince Jaehaerys' head off. We're spared the sight of that. A sound effect suffices. In the book, he lops the head off with a sword. So, again, in this paragraph, younger than 6, I do believe that he said therefore. Ryan Condal, that is. And this part where instead she offers a necklace instead of her life, for some reason, and I'm not sure if this is just because in my head when I was watching the scene, I had the scene in Fire and Blood, because I was reading Fire and Blood along with watching the season, but I'd already known what was going to happen with Blood and Cheese. Like, I already know most of what's going to happen. And after this blog post and George literally just going on to spoil half of the future of the book, I'm probably just going to go ahead and read the book before season 3 and 4 come out, because there's no point in really hanging around waiting whenever I'm talking about this online as well. But I went into season 2 knowing that it was going to open with blood and cheese and knowing what blood and cheese was going to entail. And so I don't know if it's because I just came in with that like bias of already knowing what was supposed to happen in Blood and Cheese, that in my head I thought that she'd offered her life as well after the necklace. But then I went back and checked the scripts and she doesn't. So I was considerably compelled by this point, because obviously offering a necklace, even though like she obviously thinks they're just some types of thugs that are on like trying to steal from the Red Keep, which they do during the sequence. They do come in. The first thing that they do is steal the gold dragons off the table in Aemon's room. But, you know, again, she's obviously misunderstanding why they're there, in the same way that she misunderstands in the later episodes why the small folk are angry at them when the lack of food is not their fault. But yeah, I do think it is significantly different offering them an expensive necklace and offering them the life of the queen, and especially in defense of her children. So I think that was quite bizarre, but they do present the relationship between Helena and her children in a very peculiar way compared to the relationship between, say, Alicent and her children and Rhaenyra and her children, even though they're both deeply flawed. But it's quite peculiar, and I think that requires its own video, going through representations of motherhood and House of the Dragon. And at the bottom here, talking about the sound effect of having the head sawn off rather than having the head lopped off with a sword, which I thought was a much more grotesque visual than just the swift beheading that happens in the books. It's a bloody, brutal scene, no doubt. How not? An innocent child being butchered in front of his mother. So again, you still have the depth and severity of that scene and the emotional power that is behind it. But he continues. I still believe the scene in the book is stronger, and the readers have the right of that. The two killers are crueler in the book. I thought the actors who played the killers in the show were excellent, but the characters are crueler, harder, and more frightening in Fire and Blood. In the show, Blood is a gold cloak. In the book, he's a former gold cloak, stripped of his office for beating a woman to death. Book Blood is the sort of man who might think making a woman choose between her two sons which to die would be amusing, especially when they double down on the wanton cruelty by murdering the boy she tries to save. Book Cheese is worse too. He does not kick a dog, true, but he does not have a dog. And he is the one who tells Maelor that his mum wants his head. I would also suggest that Helena shows more courage, more strength in the book by offering her own life to save her son. Offering a piece of jewellery is just not the same. And I do agree with that. I do think, and I've seen similar, commentators, similar analysis channels talking about this. I think it was on the most recent podcast between Red Team Reviews and Preston Jacobs, where they were talking about the fact that in the show you kind of follow Blood and Cheese, who just see an opportunity to kill a child, and that being a lot easier than going and having to try and kill Prince Aemond, who is known as a wonderfully strong swordsman, who they might not have such a good chance with against a defenseless mother and child. But the fact that it kind of shows you, and you know what, I really don't know if this was Preston Jacobs and Red Team Reviews or if this was Voice of Old Town and Grace Goblins, but it was one of the two podcasts anyway. So I was kind of trying to hold off to see other people's reactions to this so that I could kind of integrate them into this video. But essentially they were saying the shock and horror of the event is kind of taken away whenever you follow the perpetrators, and they seem just being opportunistic, and it kind of takes the horror of the unknown away whenever you're following and seeing them plotting and scheming. Do you know what I mean? And they used the reference that if it came to the Red Wedding and you had a scene beforehand of the Freys sitting plotting what they were going to do and like what weapons they were going to use to stab who and what music they were going to be playing in the background, it would kind of take away the gut punch that was the actual scene and deaths within the Red Wedding. But again, it was still very effective as me seeing it for the first time as someone who had not read the full sequence at that stage. I also love the fact that he references about Cheese's dog and how this became such a significant character far beyond the life and impact of Cheese himself. An important pointer that he made about Blood was obviously the fact that Blood was a former gold cloak in the book because of his violence against women, which would further support the fact that he is just brutish and awful and a nightmarish man, and that he has very little inhibition about targeting women and children. And so it obviously makes a lot more sense whenever we see him go in and carry out this gruesome act. In the show, obviously, he's just a gold cloak who still has some allegiance to Damon. As I saw it, the Sophie's Choice aspect was the strongest part of the sequence, the darkest, the most visceral. I hated to lose that. And judging from the comments online, most of the fans seemed to agree. When Ryan Condal first told me what he meant to do ages ago, back in 2022 might be, I argued against it for all these reasons. I did not argue long or with much heat, however. The changes weakened the sequence, I felt, but only a bit, and Ryan had what seemed to be practical reasons for it. They did not want to deal with casting another child, especially a 2-year-old toddler. Kids that young will inevitably slow down production, and there would be budget implications. Budget was already an issue on House of the Dragon, and it made sense to save money where we could. Moreover, Ryan assured me that we were not losing Prince Maelor, simply postponing him. Queen Helena could still give birth to him in season 3, presumably after getting with child late season 2. This made sense to me, so I withdrew my objections and acquiesced to the change. And so this is a very interesting paragraph. We get the first mention of Ryan Condal directly by name, full call out. He starts off by talking about Sophie's Choice aspect, which obviously was a lot of people's issue. The fact that one of the main points in this scene, having to choose between the two brothers, was the fact that you have the Sophie's Choice. She chose for Maelor to die, and they went against this, killed Jaehaerys, and killed the son and heir, and how this affected her characterization in the story going forward and her guilt about the whole thing. It's strange we don't really get to see much of that guilt in House of the Dragon, but alas. She's obviously a very different character with different characterization. Then he talks about Ryan Condal, obviously having issues with this because of having to cast a young child actor and monetary reasons, which were obviously an issue throughout House of the Dragon. And, the results of, I assume this was before they had finalized the scripts and long before they'd realized that they were going to be cutting from 10 episodes to 8. So the fact that there was even monetary issues then, before they had the 2 episodes lopped off the end, is very concerning. And obviously highlights the impact that budget had whenever it was cut down to 8, even more so. But then the fact that it's also talking about the child actor situation, which we spoke about whenever we spoke about that episode. There are obviously a lot of issues around the casting of child actors, what you can do in terms of things that they can witness on set, because obviously they're children and they can be traumatized. And there's also the issue of child memory not being the same as an adult's memory, and so could blend between fiction and reality. And there's also situations of time that they can be on set. They can only obviously film for limited hours because of legal issues and, workers' rights, especially for child actors in Hollywood, which thanks be to God. But at the same time, it's obviously going to restrict set. There are a number of practical issues that Ryan illustrated to George and was like, we can't do this. So George begrudgingly accepted because Ryan assured him that Maelor was not getting cut and could be incorporated into season 3. And because we kind of had this idea, and a lot of people were talking about the fact that no, we're not like losing Maelor because Maelor's cog was in that blood sequence in the intro of season 1. His cog is there. And so people were like, we're going to get Maelor. They're going to incorporate him. Didn't incorporate him into season 2. And people were kind of like, how's this going to work now? Because Aegon obviously confirms in episode 7, 8 that he can no longer reproduce because his secondary sexual characteristics no longer exist, or at least don't exist in the way that they once were and are definitely no longer functional. And so then I just started having these nightmarish visions about Aemon coming in and doing something to her, or someone else doing something, and this resulting in the birth of Maelor and them trying to tie it in that way because they could still preserve brutality to the story and illustrate more suffering through it. But they could still incorporate the character but not having to tie it to Aegon. So they could still have like what happens. Obviously, we're going to get to this in the spoiler section, but what happens to him, to the Kingsguard, to Helena, like everything that's going to happen surrounding Maelor. But obviously we had no confirmation of this, and this was just me imagining things. Whereas now George is saying that this might not be the case. I still love the episode and the blood and cheese sequence overall. Losing the Helena's choice beat did weaken the scene, but not to any great degree. Only the book readers would even notice its absence. Viewers who had never read Fire and Blood would still find the scenes heartrending. Maelor did not actually do anything in the scene after all. How could he? He was two. So there's another aspect to the removal of the young princeling, however, and this is where he gets into the changes, the butterfly effect, the title of this whole thing. So this is your spoiler warning. This is where George R. R. Martin gives a spoiler warning. This is yours too. If you don't want anything spoiled for season 3, season 4, any further in the book Fire and Blood, if you're also reading along with the show, stop watching now. Thank you so much for being here. See you in the next one. But for anybody else who wishes to continue with this, let's get on it. For those of you who hate spoilers, I would stop reading here. Spoilers will follow, at least for the readers among you. If you've never read Fire and Blood, maybe it does not matter, because I am going to spoil here the things that happen in the book which may never happen on the series, starting with Maelor himself. Sometime between the initial decision to remove Maelor, a big change was made. The prince's death was no longer just going to be pushed back to season 3, he was never going to be born at all. The younger son of Aegon and Helena would never appear. Most of you know the butterfly effect, I assume. Yes, there was a movie with that title a few years back. It's a familiar concept in chaos theory as well. And then he talks about it, science fiction fans being exposed to the theory from Ray Bradbury's classic, A Sound of Thunder, where obviously man goes back, Jurassic story, steps in butterfly, comes back, everything's changed, different president, whatever. And basically saying that change begets change. And even small and seemingly insignificant alterations to a timeline or story can have profound effects on all that follow. And then he goes into how this affects Fire and Blood and the House of the Dragon show. Maelor is a 2-year-old toddler in Fire and Blood, but like our butterfly, he has an impact in the story all out of proportion to his size. The readers among you may recall that when it appears that Rhaenyra and her blacks are about to capture King's Landing, Queen Alicent becomes concerned for the safety of Helena's remaining children and takes steps to save them by smuggling them out of the city. The task is given to 2 knights of the King's Guard. Sir Willis Fell is commanded to deliver Prince Jaehaerys to the Baratheons at Storm's End, while Maelor is given over to Sir Rickard Thorne to be escorted across the Mander to the protection of the Hightower army on its way to King's Landing. Willis Fell delivers Jaehaerys safely to the Baratheons at Storm's End, but Sir Rickard fares less well. He and Maelor get as far as Bitterbridge, where he is revealed as a Kingsguard in a tavern called the Hog's Head. Once discovered, Sir Rickard fights bravely to protect the young charge and bring him to safety, but he does not make it across the bridge before some crossbows bring him down. Prince Maelor is torn from his arms and then sadly ripped to pieces by the mob who are fighting over the boy and the huge reward that Rhaenyra has offered for his capture in return. And so, this, obviously, big spoiler for anybody who hasn't read Fire and Blood, and the fact that this may eventually come in the show in some way, shape, or form if they do decide to pull a Daeron and cast him and just kind of throw him into the story in the next season. But we have yet to see if anything like that's going to happen. At this stage, it's definitely not included in the outline for season 3, but that could all change after this blog post has been posted and the response online for it, because a lot of people are seemingly agreeing with this. And I myself also agree to an extent. I do think there's workarounds for a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, it's not going to have the same impact as it does in Fire and Blood. And so they're really going to have to stretch themselves to try and include these things that could have very easily been included by just having, a swaddled baby, a swaddled doll even in scenes, and just saying that it was Maelor. Could have been a lot easier, but alas, here we are. Here we're talking about taking up King's Landing. Alicent sends children away to keep them safe. Jaehaerys is safely delivered by Willis Fell to the Baratheons in Storm's End. But again, we get the scene of Bitterbridge where Sir Rickard, who is the Kingsguard that we've already been introduced to in him taking Alicent out to the Kingswood for that little camping scene at the end of season 2. Her going out to the lake and whatever. That was Sir Rickard Thorne who took her out and assisted and facilitated that outing outside the castle. So I think it's interesting the fact that they haven't introduced Maelor, but they have introduced Sir Rickard Thorne and made him significant enough that we got him called out by name. He has multiple speaking roles, whereas other Kingsguard have not. Like those other men who were in the background of the scene where Kristen is confronting Arik and sending him to Dragonstone. We never really get introduced to those other Kingsguard, as far as I'm aware. I know people online have deduced who they are, but like they don't really have any significant role. Um, and Rhaenyra's remaining Kingsguard don't really have that much of a significant role, in so much that we actually get scenes with Sir Rickard Thorne outside the castle interacting with Queen Alicent, and yet they haven't introduced Maelor, who is a very, very, very significant part of his story and his story's end. So he then continues, will any of this appear in the show? Maybe, but I don't see how. The butterflies would seem to prohibit it. If you perhaps make Sir Rickard's ward be Jaehaera instead of Maelor, but Jaehaera can't be killed. She has a huge role to play as Aegon's next heir. Could maybe make Maelor a newborn instead of a 2-year-old, but it would scramble up the timeline, which is a bit of a mess already. And this is kind of what I was suggesting about they could have just had some sort of child doll swaddled in the corner. And I've seen a couple of other people talking about that as well. Like it would have been a very simple alternative to doing all this and ending up in this complicated situation. But alas, here we are. It also would have been a very smart idea from the showrunners to keep George happy, just in terms of facilitating him wanting Maelor to be included, and they could have avoided all of this. But here we go. I have no idea what Ryan has planned, if indeed he has planned anything. But given Maelor's absence from episode 2, the simplest way to proceed would be just to drop him entirely, lose the bit where Alicent tries to send the children to safety, drop Rickard Thorne, or send him with Willis Fell so Jaehaera has 2 guards. And so that obviously is the point where he is very much calling out Ryan Condal again by name, and with the statement, if indeed he has anything planned at all. People seem this to be very, very intense, directed, and pointed in a very sharp and direct way at Ryan Condal, and illustrating that George obviously has his grievances with how Ryan has been handling his show, which I imagine would be very difficult for Ryan to handle because Ryan has admitted himself that he has been a fan of this franchise for a very long time, and I know myself and many other fans would probably feel very uncomfortable if we were a fan of something, we got the pleasure of working on it, and then the creator had a massive issue with how we'd handled the situation, the material. But you know, it's one of those things, isn't it? Ryan, unlike us, has a direct line of contact with George R. R. Martin, and so you would imagine that most of this, and this is also true of George putting all this out on the internet, most of this seems like it could very much could have been an email, not a meeting. Do you know what I mean? It could have been an email or a phone call rather than a blog post that's going out to millions of fans, book fans, TV fans, and is now a story being carried by major outlets of news, of, you know, fans like Gossip, of T channels, whatever. And it's now being spread like wildfire amongst the fandom, even though he has taken down the original blog post. So clearly, you know, there is some degree of regret or issue with that being out there now. From what I know, it seems to be what Ryan is doing here. It's simplest, yes, and may make sense in terms of budgets and shooting schedules, but simpler is not better. The Bitterbridge scene has tension, suspense, action, bloodshed, a bit of heroism, and a lot of tragedy. Rickard Thorne is a tertiary character at best. Most viewers, as opposed to readers, will never even know that he's gone, since they never knew him at all, which I would debate the slightest bit because obviously we did get introduced to him in a kind of significant way at the end of season 3, or at the end of season 2. But alas. But I'd rather give him a brief moment of heroism, a taste of courage, loyalty to the Kingsguard, regarding of whether they are black or green. The butterflies are not done with this yet, however. In the book, when word of Prince Maelor's death and the grisly manner of his passing on page 505 reaches the Red Keep, it provides the thing that drives Queen Helena to suicide. She could barely stand to look at Maelor, knowing that she had chosen him to die in the Sophie's Choice scene. And now he is dead in truth. Her words have come true. The grief and guilt are too much for her to bear. And so, obviously, it's been spoken about in the fandom. It was spoken about in that podcast between Red Team Review and Preston Jacobs that this does not seem to be entirely true, because there is about 30 odd pages of material in between the death of Maelor and in between Helena's suicide. And there is a number of other things that happen in between that time, including significant deaths on the green side, which may also have contributed. And, it could have been an accumulation of these things that led to Helena's suicide. But here we are being told by George R. R. Martin that it is a direct cause and effect between the death of Maelor and the death of Helena. And so he is the writer. He did produce this world, these characters, and this source material, so we kind of have to take his word for it. In Ryan's outline for season 3, Helena still kills herself for no particular reason. There's no fresh horror, no triggering event to overwhelm the fragile young queen. And so a lot of people's major issue with this blog post comes with this exact line, because he is exposing the outline for season 3 that has been put forward by Ryan Condal at this stage, to him, to the writers, whoever. And so a lot of people clearly have an issue with the fact that he is directly spoiling season 3. And obviously we know there's going to be changes between the book and the show. And so he is spoiling the show, like book already out there. It's been out there since 2018. If it, like, people are going to get spoiled for it, you know what I mean? The information's out there. But this is insider exclusive information that George R. R. Martin has access to about the production of House of the Dragon, that he is just kind of putting out there, which may be some sort of breach of contract, and could also be the reason that this blog post is now taken down this exact line here, where he's talking about the outline for season 3, which he may not be authorized to do so at this stage. And the final butterfly follows soon thereafter. Queen Helena, a sweet and gentle soul, is much beloved by the small folk of King's Landing. Rhaenyra was not, so when rumours began to arise that Helena did not kill herself but was rather murdered at Rhaenyra's command, the Commons are quick to believe them. The Commons, what a very bizarre way to refer to human beings, but pop off, George. That night, King's Landing rose in bloody riot. I wrote on page 506 of Fire and Blood. It is the beginning of the end of Rhaenyra's rule over the city, ultimately leading to the storming of the Dragon Pit and the rise of the Shepherd's mob that drives Rhaenyra to flee the city, return to Dragonstone, and her death. Maelor by himself means little. He is a small child, does not have a single line of dialogue, does nothing of consequence but die. But where and when and how, that does matter. Losing Maelor weakened the end of the blood and cheese sequence, but it also cost us the bitter bridge scene in all its horror and heroism. It undercut the motivation for Helena's suicide, and that in turn sent thousands into the streets and alleys screaming for justice for their murdered queen. None of that is essential, I suppose, but all of it does serve a purpose. It all helps tie the storylines together. So one thing follows another in a logical and convincing manner. What will we offer the fans instead once we've killed these butterflies? I have no idea. I do not recall that Ryan and I ever discussed this back when he first told me they were pushing back on Aegon's second son. Maelor himself is not essential, but losing him means that we lose Bitterbridge, Helena's suicide, and the riots. Well, that's a considerable loss. There are larger and more toxic butterflies to come if House of the Dragon goes ahead with some of the changes being contemplated for season 3 and 4. Signed off, GRRM. So that's the end of the blog post. We can see in the last 3 paragraphs of this that it does get quite damning. Obviously, he talks about how, affecting the scenes with Maelor affects the scenes with Helena, affects the scenes with Rhaenyra because of this butterfly effect. And, it affects the death of Helena, affects the death of Rhaenyra, and obviously the storm of the Dragon Pit and everything that happens with that. With the riots, with the mobs, it's going to affect a lot of what happens to our significant characters, be they human, dragon, whatever. And then in that final major paragraph, he's obviously talking again about the plans for season 3 and 4. And he's obviously got a bit of insight into those changes. And I think it's probably where this blog post has sprung from, because he obviously, and like a lot of people were talking about this too, the fact that he did not have a whole lot to say about Dave and Dan and their show running during Game of Thrones. I mean, I have a lot of questions about how much of that he actually paid attention to beyond a specific point, because obviously he's sitting being like, right, well, they're not even running my material anymore, and I've really just given them an outline of story beats to hit. So at some stage it does just kind of feel like a checklist of we've had this, now we can just throw in a bunch of actor shots to get Emmys. So I feel like maybe George kind of detached himself from that a bit. But also it is notable that he didn't really have that much to say about them particularly, and the fact that they'd done so much to deviate his original characters and their character motivations, their characterization, as well as the plot points of the story. So it's kind of interesting. A lot of people are highlighting the fact that he didn't have a whole lot to say there, but he has a whole lot to say here. And, this might be a direct result of the fact that his source material was so significantly deviated from by those original showrunners on their original main show, and him being kind of traumatized by that, and he's trying to prevent House of the Dragon going the same way that Game of Thrones did by putting out this blog post. Again, it does kind of raise these issues of like, why could this not have just been a conversation that happened internally with HBO, with the showrunners, with the writing room, and with George R. R. Martin? But does that highlight the fact that there maybe is some sort of communication difficulties? We're not sure. Is there some sort of conflict between these groups where we originally thought there was harmony? Not sure. A lot of people were confused about the fact that he wasn't super involved in the writing of season 2 of House of the Dragon in the same way that he maybe was with season 1. It was said in the behind the episodes and interviews and stuff they gave in the official podcast that George was still tied in with production. Like if you go back and you rewatch them, he's still tied in, but he's not sitting in the writing room. They essentially said that the writers were taking over and taking it in their own direction, which was already admitted. So I don't know why so many people were confused about this fact and thought that George R. R. Martin was a lot more involved than he was. This is obviously made clear by him and the production and the writers and the showrunners. There are also questions on why he deleted this post, and I think a lot of that probably has to do with the fact that he does talk about the outline of season 3 and alludes to outlines for season 3 and 4. And I think this may be some sort of breach of contract. I'm not entirely sure. But I imagine because they have such an airtight lock on scripts and stuff, I mean, obviously, whole last episode was leaked, so clearly it's not that airtight on the actual episodes themselves. But we've seen how much jumping through hoops that they did with Game of Thrones to try and avoid scripts being leaked again. So, obviously they have a lot of security protocol, and this probably goes against the security protocol just to go out and put on your blog post as the source material creator exactly what is supposed to be in season 3. With regards to the ending of one character who is quite significant, and Helena is a lot more significant in the show than she is in the book. It's completely undeniable. And so, it is kind of significant, spoiling what's going to happen to her and her ultimate end. So I imagine that's what it is. But again, we might never find out. We might find out in an additional blog post where he might have, explained why the other one had to be taken down. I'm not sure, but that's my speculation on the matter. We also need to consider, will this spell positive or negative changes for the show? In terms of positive changes, will they listen to George more because they are absolutely terrified of this happening again? Or will he become more detached from the show because this sours relations? And so will we have less input from him, which would not be very desirable because obviously they're going to stray further from the source material and what he actually wants from the show, which is essentially what especially readers want, but watchers in general. We want to have like the most legitimate and faithful adaptation of the source material into a show. And I think something that we haven't really, or that I personally haven't seen a whole lot of people talking about, is the fact we need to consider how this is going to affect Duncan Egg, Conquest Show, Nymeria, the Young Sea Snake, whatever, any other things that are, in production, greenlit, that are being pitched as pilots. Like, we have focused so much time and attention on this Conquest Show and following along and looking at what Mattson Tomlin's doing and getting really excited about it. This could potentially be the downfall of all that if he's going to sour relations with HBO. They obviously have a lot invested in him and his universe in the Song of Ice and Fire. This is like one of their main, if not their main flagship show. They literally timed the launch of their whole HBO Max thing coming to Europe in line with season 2 of House of the Dragon. And so clearly they have a lot of stock invested in this. They have a lot of material benefit coming from this. And they really depend on this relationship with George R. R. Martin. So they really need to get working on this. But it could sour relations. And they might have issues with the adaptation of, this other Conquest show, which is from the same source material in Fire and Blood. And they are still working with this condensed, unreliable history, bias, based on maesters, whatever situation. They're trying to work with this source material. Mattson Tomlin's putting together a pitch for it and, trying to get it greenlit, but it's not greenlit at the minute. So it could end up, that might get scrapped if all this goes sour, goes awry, whatever. We really need to be talking about that. And we need to be talking about the importance of the Aegon's Conquest show to the continuation of this franchise. And so I'm going to be doing a video about that after this one. So stick around if that's something you're interested in. We'll be doing everything we know so far and an update, and then talking about the importance of it and the fact that they need to get all their eggs in a basket and figure it out. Figure it out with showrunners, writers, especially George R. R. Martin. HBO need to quit their nonsense. We're going to go into their statement as well just after this, but I want to cover just a couple more points here. Fandom is split, as usual. Nothing new here. Fandom's always split, fandom's always up to something, but it seems significantly split in two different camps. One of people who think that George is perfectly justified in doing this because it's his source material, it's his story, it's his characters, and he should be able to voice his opinion about how people are handling it because this is the way a lot of people are getting introduced to his story. And if he doesn't feel that it's a faithful adaptation, obviously he should be able to voice that because it's his franchise. But then there's also the people who are like, this was very unprofessional. This could have been a phone call. This didn't need to be a massive public call out to Ryan Condal, to the other writers in the show, to HBO, whoever else, specifically Ryan Condal, because he has mentioned multiple times throughout the post. But, people are split in these two camps. I just want to put it out there. These things do not have to be mutually exclusive. This does not need to be a two camp situation. You can look at this and think, should have been an internal email, should have been a phone call, should have been a meeting. Did not have to be like a public call out post. But at the same time, George is entirely within his rights to do this. I mean, maybe not the exposing season 3 outlines, because that might not actually be within his legal rights to do. But everything else, like if he wants to talk about a story and the impact of like omitting certain bits, he should be able to, because it's his story. But at the same time, was it kind of unprofessional? Probably. Should it have been an email and internal discussion? Probably. But that's my 2 cents in the matter. And I do feel for him because it would be really frustrating if you'd put all of yourself, so much of yourself into this world that you'd created, that you'd written about, and then people are just kind of going off script with it and expecting you to be okay with it whenever you've already expressed that you're kind of annoyed about it. Although I do have to note the fact that he said that he didn't really come at it with much ferocity, heat, fervor, whatever. He perhaps, and obviously I'm not blaming George for this, but like it might have not come across that he was annoyed as much as he was, because the fact that he admitted himself that he didn't really go for these changes to be reverted back to his original story. Do you know what I mean? Like within the blog post himself, he talks about, but it's one of those things. I think something important that we need to remember as well is the fact that these shows are also part of George's legacy. These are like part of his franchise. These are part of this is how so many people was introduced to his work as well. That he should have agency over how his legacy is handled and prevent it from being mishandled. So just to talk about HBO's response when we are discussing all this, because obviously I have waited long enough that they were able to respond, and we are also going to look at Ryan Condal's discussion about it very briefly at the end of this in the House of the Dragon official podcast. So HBO responded to George R.R. Martin's complaints about season 2 of House of the Dragon by saying there are few greater fans of George R.R. Martin and his book Fire and Blood than the creative team on House of the Dragon, both in production and at HBO. Commonly, when adapting a book to the screen, with its own format and limitations, the showrunner ultimately is required to make difficult choices about the characters and story that the audience will follow. We believe that Ryan Condal and his team have done an extraordinary job, and the millions of fans the series have amassed over the first 2 seasons will continue to enjoy it. And that was through Variety that was released. Now, as much as I think that was lovely and professional, and it's very nice that HBO were coming out and backing their showrunners and creative team, how about you back and believe in your showrunners and creative team and the writing room when they are telling you that they need 10 episodes for a season to tell this story effectively, and instead you're giving them budget cuts and you're lopping 2 episodes off the end of each season. This really needed 4 seasons of 10 episodes apiece, and instead you're giving us the last 3 seasons potentially with 8 episodes, which is cutting a good 6 episodes off what should have been given as a story arc to these writers, to this creative team that you're now praising. If you really believe in your showrunners and your creative team, give them 10 episodes for season 3 and season 4. Because you have done so much damage to this franchise that is potentially unfixable for a lot of people because of the story decisions that were made by the budget limitations and cutting off these 2 episodes. Believe in your showrunners when it matters, not just whenever you have to come out and do some damage control because the actual show, like source material, the producer, the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, of Fire and Blood, is coming out and saying something now. This might not have even been an issue if you had just given them enough money, enough time to go and actually make the show that they wanted to make. They could have included all this, it wouldn't have been an issue. But again, it also comes down to Ryan Condal. You have to listen to George R. R. Martin. Like, fair play, again, the HBO for coming out and supporting their writers. But it doesn't really mean very much whenever you're just coming out and you're saying it instead of actually doing things that physically and materially support your writers. So there's that to think about. We have the House of the Dragon official podcast, which was uploaded mere hours before the blog post because they obviously had a feeling in their water, which is a nice wee Irish idiom that we have for when you have an intuitive feeling about something, you have it in your water that something's going to come out, that something's going to happen. And they obviously had a feeling in their water that George R. R. Martin was going to release this blog post, and they managed to time it perfectly to the fact that they somehow posted this on Wednesday. And, a couple hours later, if even that, George R. R. Martin's blog post came out. They did a surprise bonus episode. I think there was only meant to be one more bonus episode left, but then they randomly uploaded this one with with Ryan Condal, the showrunner. They were like, "Oh, fun bonus episode where Ryan Condal's coming to talk to us." And you know what? I read out basically word for word what he says about this, and I will read some quotes from it. But if you want to see the whole interview again, go and see it there. He starts talking specifically with regards to the question, how do you work with George when you're making these decisions? It said about 41 minutes if you want to go and watch it yourself. Again, I have a lot of it written down here, but I'm going to try and paraphrase it for the sake of time because it's already becoming a really long video and I have a lot more to record today. And it's also one of the hottest days of the summer, even though it's now autumn. So it's getting a bit hot under this ring light. So I'm going to try and power through it here for you. Condal says, the writing we do in the show is always available to him. We show casting tapes, cuts, art department presentations that are done before the season. I would say everything's made available to him. And I've always taken his feedback where possible. There are, of course, places where we have not agreed and departed, and some of those things are just a specific condition of things I talked about. The making of the show, telling a subjective story, not telling the subjective history. Like, for example, we can't do 17 set pieces across the making of the show. We have to pick our spots. The trouble with the show is when you go big, you have to go really big, or you can't go big everywhere. I think most of the differences have come in there. And so basically what I have to say about that is the fact, obviously, this whole episode is damage control. They're putting it out, trying to do damage limitation at least. And he is trying to say his bit that he is conversing with George R. R. Martin. He's trying to take on his criticism as much as possible, but also there are a lot of limitations in the scope of TV. And he goes on to talk about that, just the differences in, and this is the part I'm going to summarize. So that whole first part was quote. This part I'm going to summarize. So he follows that he's always trying to take on the notes and the pivots and make the thing work. But he also talks about the fact that the condition of being a showrunner is making a million and one decisions, and that a lot of them you have to make fast and you have to run with and accept the decisions and how it affects other decisions that you're going to have to do. And then he talks about the fact doing solo art forms like writing a book is very different than these big collaborative pieces like TV production. And now to this point, George R. R. Martin has worked in film and TV. And so I don't think, and like obviously it was a while ago that he was like properly on set, like working on film and TV. So things have changed, practices have changed, the industry is obviously rapidly changing and advancing. But at the same time, he does have experience with this. It's not like he's completely outside of the scope and has no idea what's going on. And he also has been working collaboratively with his production team, with these writers, with the showrunner. And as much as he is very particular, George R. R. Martin is very particular about the adaptation of his work. And obviously, at the end of the Game of Thrones, he probably got very disillusioned with the whole TV franchise thing. Whenever they eventually came back around, they had the failure of Blood Moon, and then they brought about House of the Dragon. It was a massive success, and he's obviously very anxious about the downfall of this. And so whenever he starts to see complications and issues happening in season 2, and I enjoyed season 2, right? As a viewer, I enjoyed it. But I also do accept there was a million and one issues that need to be dealt with that would have been a lot bigger issues to the creator of this franchise than they would have been to me or other viewers. Do you know what I mean? Even if you're a book reader and you feel very strongly about this, no one's going to feel more strongly about it than George R. R. Martin himself. And so it makes perfect sense that he's going to have these issues and that he might potentially be a bit difficult to deal with when it comes to, like, say, you're the person who is adapting his show. And so there's a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. And Ryan obviously feels that, but I feel like, again, as much as this could have been an email from George, it should have been email and contact constantly from Ryan Condal, and he should really be taking the words of George into consideration when he's making this show. So that is going to be my coverage in the matter. That was George's blog post, HBO's response, and Ryan Condal's damage control on the official House of the Dragon podcast. And so probably going to look at some fan reaction and see how everyone's responding to this, and then come back and potentially make another video on this. But otherwise, hopefully that condensed everything into one video for you all to view. And I hope you enjoyed. So if you have any questions, comments, how you felt about this blog post, how you felt about HBO's response and Ryan Condal's response, please feel free to leave it in the comments and I'll get back to everyone. I look forward to having that conversation with you down there. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.